So Margaret and Lisa are going to lead us through this presentation. This is a presentation about our district assessment portfolio. A lot of conversation, a lot of political winds that shift when we talk about New York State assessments and grade level assessments and what those measure and what they don't. And you have heard many presentations over the last couple of years about benchmark assessments or iReady or different assessments that that teachers give or that special educators give. So this is sort of giving you a 30,000-foot view of how do we measure student growth over time, what do we do with that information, and how those data sets help inform us about student achievement. So I'll turn it over to Margaret and Lisa, and I think I'm going to get out of the way here, so I'm sitting in front of it.
So a district always looks internally to answer that very first question, which was made famous by Dufour many years ago. How will we know that they have learned what we taught? And we know we have to answer to the Regents program and the New York State 3-8 testing, but it's up to us, and actually the state even tells us it's up to you, to internally maintain a system that can be put up against our assessments and say, yes, this child is in need of help, or no, that day was a bad day, or the kid just didn't care about the performance on that test. So the district portfolio looks at benchmark assessments, diagnostic assessments, pre-assessments, informative assessments, summative assessments, and then of course the state assessments. So we're going to take a look at all the different types and talk about it. I gave you some examples, and as I was actually copying these for you, and we'll talk about it as we go through the slides, many of the examples I gave you sit in multiple places. So it's a benchmark, but it's also formative, and it's formative, but so we'll talk about that. So benchmark and diagnostic assessments. Benchmark assessments are administered to all of our students at predetermined times, usually in this district, September, October, January, and then May into June. Some of that is required through RTI, so the Universal Screener, which is iReady, is a requirement for every district to have. We have to have iReady. Some districts use STAR or NWA MAPS. These assessments measure student progress against standards for the grade or the course at that time of the year. So it's a stopping point to say, how is Lisa doing? Lisa's doing very well compared to where the rest of third grade is in September, or the rest of third grade is in January. Diagnostic assessments drill a little bit deeper through some surface level misconceptions to figure out where specifically should I be teaching. So I listed for you some of our benchmarks/diagnostics. Many of these names you've already heard us mention. iReady does both ELA and math. Our teachers K-8 use the FNP benchmark assessments, which is a reading measure. The FAR and the FAM are acronyms which we love in education for the Pfeiffer Assessment of Reading and the Pfeiffer Assessment of Math. It's a more specific drill down into those two areas to break out where the struggle sits. Key Math is also a math assessment that does similar things. That's used right now at the middle school, but not at elementary. The high school teams in their departments have created content level benchmarks. So the English department has benchmarks that they administer fall, winter, spring, the math department, etc. Those were designed by the team of teachers. Reading inventories, and I say that because even though the benchmark assessment could be considered a reading inventory, I know at the high school level, Melanie St. Pierre, who's the reading teacher up there, uses a lot of things, Beta, QRI, ARI, with her kids, based on where she thinks they're at and what she's trying to measure. And then this year, when we added the 3 AIS math people at elementary, they spent the summer creating what we're calling skills assessments. So the students in second grade in September took a math assessment that looked back at the first grade learning and said to the second grade teacher, Lisa remembered everything she was taught in first grade, or here are some areas where Lisa is still confused based on the first grade skills. What that allows the teachers to do is right at the beginning to try to fill that gap before they move on to new information. So that's really what a benchmark or a diagnostic assessment does. It helps us drill down and figure out where we see points of trouble, and then it's up to us to figure out what the instructional plan is that follows on.
Can we talk a little bit more about the FAR and the FAN?
Go right ahead.
So the FAR and the FAN we brought on last year. So this is a brand new test that's out there. And what the state said is now you can start talking about dyslexia and dysgraphia. We can't diagnose. However, we can start talking about it. Before it's been a no-no, you weren't able to talk about it. So we will get these kids that have IQs of 108, 109, but they're not reading and we can't figure it out. So last year, Margaret and I sat down and I said, listen, there's these 2 new assessments. We can use them this way and only psychologists do them, or we have a psychologist train our reading teachers and train our math teachers on how to utilize them. And it's interesting because we talked about a kid yesterday, and when you look at his testing data and then you look at the FAR, this FAR is so much more in depth than the typical WISC or the WIAT that we would do for a full assessment for a special education classification. So we were able to really pull a lot more data, which then leads our instruction for math and or reading for AIS. So there now is a new one coming out. It's called the FAW, the Fight for Assessment of Writing, and we were just talking about it and how we could utilize that. Is it something we may purchase? Maybe. Is it something we'll train teachers or just our psychologists? It depends. We have to look at the test. It's brand new. But we're one of the first districts that have brought the FAR and the FAN in to utilize with all of our kids, just not special ed kids.
Know that as we move through the slides, some of us may be saying, oh my gosh, how much assessment are we doing? But they're for different reasons. And the other thing we need to remember is that probably about 15 years ago, when RTI became a big conversation in this state, it was already being used out west. We really were guided by the state to say that no one testing point should require remediation or remove a student from remediation. That we were to build a system where we could look at 3 or 4 data points and then say, does Lisa need help, or is it just this one piece that shows weakness? It gives you a broader picture of the student and where the need for remediation sits. Sometimes that remediation can occur in the classroom, but sometimes a specialist is needed to step in addition to the classroom instruction. So before we go to this, before we talk about the formative assessment slide, I'd like you to look at the packet I handed out. On the first page under benchmark sample, you're going to see what we call the FNP benchmark assessment. So this is an assessment for reading. And on the first page, this is just the cover sheet that the teacher will score when the student has completed their assessment. But if you turn over, you can see that you see text printed. That's the text that the child is reading. In the child's hand is a book. This is just the text that the teacher has. So the purpose of doing this first part of the test is to assess oral fluency and oral accuracy. And you'll notice that there are some places where the student made mistakes. The teacher writes above the printed word the word that the student said. That is critically important because I need to know what the error was in order to understand where and how I remediate. You'll also notice that off to the right, the teacher has made some funny symbols, MSV, some are circled, and again, the teacher is analyzing the error, figuring out whether I use meaning, syntax, or a visual cue to make the mistake, and in some cases, what I used to fix the mistake. This is critical teaching, especially with our young children, in terms of fixing some of the early on decoding issues. So if you continue on, you'll see on the next page, the teacher comes to a total and looks down at the column, and what that tells the teacher is, in those 3 really critical cueing systems for reading, we don't think about it because we're all fluent readers as adults. Which is the area that I need to step in and bolster up for that reader? Because they should be using the 3 cueing systems interchangeably, just the way you and I do without thinking about it. Okay, the other piece, as I said, is fluency. So while the student is reading about 150 words aloud, the teacher can either actually physically time the student with a timer that actually comes with the kit, or the teacher can say, did the student read like a robot? Or did the student read so fast because he thought it faster was better? And they measure that fluency on the scale that you see there. So we can teach into accuracy and decoding, we can teach into fluency and intonation, through this tool. And the last thing we do is what we call a comprehension check. So on the next page, there's a series of questions that the teacher takes the child through. It really sounds like a conversation if you were sitting next to me. It's not so much a battery of what color was Mary's dress, where did she go after the party, but more conversationally about tell me what the book was about, what was the major problem in the text, what did the character do as a result of what happened, and the teacher is scoring the students' answers based on the information that's provided. In this particular assessment, we look at 3 levels of comprehension. Within the text, which is a very literal understanding, kind of like story map skills, where did the story take place, who are the main characters. Then we look at beyond the text, which is inferential, where kids are starting to have to think a little bit about why something happened, maybe using some clues in the text, but also what they know about a particular event. And then the last thing we look at is evaluative understandings. Sometimes they're asked to comment on the author's craft in a piece. There's also a short writing piece that's given in response to the text. The teacher takes all of this information, scores it on a rubric, and it gives them some sense of what level of text they are capable of reading compared to the grade level that they're in. So this is used both as a benchmark assessment, fall, winter, spring, but then it's also used as a progress monitoring tool. So once we determine in the fall a child who is below grade level, they're going to be progress monitored much more often than a child who's reading at or above grade level. So that's an example of a tool that is used in multiple ways. So then we have something called formative assessments. So formative assessments are assessments that lead teachers into changing instruction based on the information that the child is giving them back. Pre-assessments. Before we plan for instruction, many teachers are now pausing to look ahead at a unit of study, and they'll design a short assessment, maybe 1 or 3 questions, to see what I already know about the topic that's coming. And that helps me determine how I make my groups. I may have a group of kids who know a lot about perimeter and area. I'm going to put them in a group together and maybe challenge them with something. I may have children who've never heard those words before. I clearly need to spend some time doing some deeper teaching with them. It doesn't mean that the whole class has to experience the same type of learning on a daily basis. So pre-assessments can be very critical to helping teachers make those small groups happen, sometimes even individual students. Formative assessments, again, are assessments along the way. They're quizzes that the teachers give. They're do-nows when the kids are coming into the room that are often on the smart board. You know, as everyone is coming in and settling down, tell me, 3 causes of the Civil War in your own words. What do you think happened? That information helps, again, a teacher to understand where do I go with my next steps of instruction. So teachers across our district are using all of these things interchangeably and in different grades and courses. Do-nows, exit tickets. I just taught a lesson. On your way out the door, tell me what the most important thing was that we talked about and learned about today. Sometimes you get surprised by what kids write down on that exit ticket. And you think, wait, was that kid in the room for 40 minutes with me? So all of this, homework is a formative assessment. We like parents to be involved with homework, but as a teacher, I also want to know that Lisa did the homework mostly by herself, so I can assess whether or not she understood the lesson we taught on multiple-digit multiplication that day. Conferring and anecdotal notes when I'm working side by side with Lisa, whether it's one-on-one or in a small group, I am making notes for myself about what she can do and what she is coming to do. Formative assessment typically is not graded because that's not what this formative assessment is about. It's for me, the teacher, to make some decisions, not for the teacher to get a grade. So we go back and forth about that a little bit sometimes, and it's a good conversation to have. In your packet, the next section shows you some formative assessments that actually come from our elementary math program. So what you have here is a homework example. I think this is 3rd grade. And then right behind the homework example is what's called a problem set. Both of them are there to assess what a child learns about the teaching that has been happening as the unit of study is developing. Interestingly enough, the problem set is timed, and the reason why it's timed is to allow for differentiation. So if you really understand this well, you're going to fly through it. If you're so-so, you might take a little longer. If you're really confused, you might not even get off the first page. Again, that helps the teacher with information about where the next steps in teaching need to occur. So there's just some examples of that, and there's a lot of examples of it across content. I just put my hands on the math first. The last thing we talk about is summative assessments, which is exactly what you think it is. It is an assessment given at the end of a unit of study. Most of us in our learning experience the end of the chapter test, right? Answer the questions at the end of the chapter. That's what that is. And a lot of our summative assessments are created by teachers. I have an example in your packet which is created by a set of teachers in a math course. Some of it comes with some of the programs that we use, there's no doubt about that. We see a lot of teachers now working together in groups to tweak some of the summative assessments and make them more meaningful, give kids more opportunities to write, not just to circle an answer or match one word to another word, but to actually, in their own words, explain their thinking. Again, typically all students on the grade or in the class take this assessment together. So third grade, the third grade formative assessments I showed you, all of our third grade kids in Eureka Math are taking the same unit test. That's an important conversation for the third grade teachers to have collectively when they put those assessments on the table. They can figure out, well, why did the kids in Margaret's class do better than the kids in Lisa's class did? Did she do some kind of different teaching that I can learn from? So having common summative assessments is a really critical piece to improving instruction for all kids who are experiencing the same curriculum. So some examples there: quizzes, unit tests, exit exams, chapter tests. There's nothing there that's new. And the sample that I gave you in your packet comes from a middle school level math piece. Again, you can see that this is teacher created. There are no marks from the company. I suspect that although they may have been a summative assessment attached to the course that they're using, the curriculum materials, they may have felt over time that they could improve that assessment collectively. And so there's the assessment that they have. It's several pages, and it covers the main concepts of that unit of study. So 3 through 8 NICET assessment. So, what's one of the reasons, or many reasons, why we don't just rely on the New York State assessments? They are flawed. I did a very deep dive into the ELA assessments, and some of the reading level passages were really not appropriate for the grades that they were asked to be assigned to. I gave that feedback to all of the teachers, K-8, well, 3-8, and they're taking a look at the types of questions that our kids struggled with and how they can help bolster those experiences in their day-to-day teaching, so kids are not thrown by multiple choice type questions on an ELA exam or a short constructive response. So we're working on that. The other thing that we need to think about also is, and I don't know if it's on this slide, or I know Joe added some information here. We have in the district about a 28% opt-out rate as an average across the grade levels. And if you were to look at the subgroup scoring and reporting, you would see that in many cases, a lot of the kids who are opting out are the kids who are struggling the most. And that would make sense if you think as a parent, you feel you don't want to torture your child, so those are the kids that you might remove from that experience. So it's really hard for us to put a whole lot of stock in what we're seeing. They are untimed, which some of us cheered for that when they broke that rule that it had to be timed. And then we lived through it and realized a kid could sit there for 6 hours. At some point, it's frustrating on the opposite extreme. So the kid who's nervous about being timed, he's off the hook, but now you have kids who are literally sitting there saying, if I sit a little bit longer, maybe I'll be able to figure it out. And it becomes really a torturous event for them.
It really becomes a hard fact for our special ed kids.
Yes.
When you think about even the modifications that we give them, the testing modifications, it used to be timed, so we'd give them double time. So if they get 4 hours, they get 8 hours. And how much stress is that? Now it's even harder for them because there is no time, and I can sit here forever and I can struggle. Whether it's a special ed kid, a 504 kid, it doesn't matter. That's that anxiety that's put on them. We're finding more of our special ed kids are opting out because of that fact that the stress on them when it comes to this test is enormous. So we really rely on a lot of the formative and summative assessments we do in-house. Or if they're special ed or most special ed, we do the re-evals every 3 years, and we rely on that data because that's more of an important data point for us than the day snapshot of ELA and math.
When we have stopped relying on it in the district, in some cases where we look at placement for special classes, especially at the middle school, because it's not fair to the kids that don't sit, and it shouldn't privilege kids that do sit, and it's unreliable across the board as a scoring system for us. So this really created a problem, and we're not the only people that are dealing with that.
And I want to share 2 pieces of data in terms of the insignificance of the state assessments, and I'll talk about our kids. In June of 2017, 50% of our 8th graders in June of 2017 passed the math assessment. The very following year, 81% of those students passed the Regents exam.
Yes.
The next year,
Yeah.
81%. Another data set for ELA. In June of 2014, 7th graders, 33% of 7th graders passed the 7th grade ELA test. When those kids got to 11th grade and took the Regents exam, 90% of those students passed the Regents exam. And the Regents exam is actually a lighthouse assessment across the country. It's been proven to be reliable. It doesn't change often. It's one of the most statistically significant assessments in the country. And now the Board of Regents is determining whether or not we have too many assessments or at the high school level, or we're too reliant on them. But this has been a conversation, not only our school district, but school districts in this entire region. Advocacy groups have taken on, and the previous 2 slides are basically those talking points. And when there's money behind those, when there's school reputation behind those, when we're making decisions like Margaret mentioned about AIS over a decade ago, saying, well, you know, you only got a 2 on this assessment, you're not going to be able to take all the electives you want to take the following year because of a flawed exam. That's why this district, along with others, have created their own assessment portfolio to make sure we understand where kids are, multiple measures, and can make course adjustments.
And the state actually, like as I said, provides you with that guidance. This should not be the marker that puts a kid in AIS. The district has to have a local assessment system that can either deny the result or affirm the result, and then you may make your decision appropriately. I think too, if you look, you know, and Joe and I looked a little bit deeper at the item analysis, when you have questions where 40% of the state got the question wrong, what does that tell you about the question? You know, and then we have passages that are way above grade level. You know, I was a classroom teacher at elementary. I have no problem with you assessing my children. Just assess them appropriately. Now, don't ask a 4th grader to read a 10th grade passage and then say, oh, well, you didn't get that. So there are issues there. That being said, I do think we have a very robust local system. I think that our teachers are always reflecting on that system and how we can improve it, how we can find things, as Lisa spoke to, that will give us more information about a kid so that we make sure that the support we're giving is targeted to the area where the kid is actually struggling. And we've learned a lot this past year or so by having continued conversations around performance and really drilling down to say, maybe it isn't this problem, maybe it's the problem that comes before it.
And we've had a lot of conversations about executive functioning.
Tremendous.
And that has been huge for us, having these conversations. And we're finding that we're putting kids in AIS because they're lacking skills, but they're lacking executive functioning skills. AIS math or AIS reading is not going to help you.
Define some executive functions.
They don't know how to plan. So they don't know how to get from point A to point B, and that might be setting up a math problem. It might be reading from left to right. I mean, there's so many things that are out there. So and I'm kind of segueing a little because this year in the high school we opened an executive functioning class for 9th graders. Certain 9th graders were targeted and recommended by the 8th grade teachers. I recently sent Dr. Wynn to an executive functioning conference for the elementary school. So that's going to be our next thing, is to roll out executive functioning at the elementary school and target those 4th and 5th graders,
Yeah.
and then move them to middle school and do the same thing, because the more we can help them figure out how to plan, how to execute, how to finish something, how to time
Try
management,
to be present.
it's so huge, how to focus. And Dr. Wood came back and she goes, oh my gosh, I'm so excited, I gotta tell you about all this. So I've met with her the last 2 days and I know more about executive functioning than I've ever known before. And it's good stuff, but it's stuff that you think is common sense in our world. Like we knew how to do that. Kids now don't know how to do that.
They lead
Why
a
is
very
that?
different lifestyle, and we're seeing more and more kids, and I don't want to use the word stressed, but I don't know what
It
the right
is.
word is.
It is.
Scattered, and I'm not sure what the, what's behind it, but I met with someone today, and we were talking about this child's performance, and I said, they have to be ready to learn. They have to be able to take in the instruction. It doesn't matter, you could be the greatest teacher on the planet, but if I have blockers that are making this inaccessible to me, if I can't focus, if I'm hungry, if I'm angry, I can't take in that instruction. So there may come a time when AIS reading is the right move for that student, but until I resolve the other issues, all of that help is meaningless because it's hitting like a force field that the kid has put up unknowingly. Most of our kids are not sitting there presenting this way just to annoy a teacher. They can't help themselves.
I think
So,
your question,
you know,
Carol, is
that's-
why? Why
Yeah,
is that?
yeah.
I'm seeing more and more kids attached to the phones, attached to the
Yeah.
tablets, attached to a TV, attached to something, and they're not learning. So I don't know about you, but when my kids were little, they were outside, they were figuring
Right.
things out, they were in the mud, they were in the dirt, they were rolling around and catching fish. Why does the fish do this?
Yeah.
What does the hook do? Things like that. You're not seeing that with kids. And I'm not saying just here, it's across the nation. And more people are talking about executive functioning.
And the executive functioning piece, to be ready and present
Present.
to receive instruction, is on the learning side of the teacher. On the behavioral side, we have been dealing with this with DBT, and you've heard presentations from our social workers and psychologists of how do we teach kids skills to regulate themselves before their behavior, their overt behavior, is dysregulated. Here we're
You're right.
talking about very quiet, internal, covert educational behavior. So the philosophy is the same. It's how do we teach the skills to be ready to learn?
Right.
It's a different ballgame.
And we're finding it younger and younger. And that's the thing that we were talking about. And I was in a
Scary.
team meeting yesterday,
It is very
and
scary.
it's scary when I'm thinking about these 5 and 6-year-olds coming in, and I'm looking at them going, we have a lot of work to do. And then I look at our 13 and 14-year-olds saying, oh my goodness, we have a lot of work to do. Do they mirror? They don't mirror, but it's the same exact issue, executive functioning. How do I plan? Really, how do I become present to learn and to take in what you want to provide for me?
We've already done some, I guess, what we used to call learning style changes in our classrooms. A lot of teachers, as you all know, are experimenting with movable furniture and yoga balls and opportunities for kids who, when we were kids, was just a kid who couldn't sit still. So, years ago in classrooms, that was a problem if you couldn't sit still. You were likely the kid in trouble because you couldn't sit still. You couldn't stay in your seat. Teachers now are learning to be more flexible about that. If I can focus by standing in the back of the room and I'm not bothering anybody, then why not make that accommodation? So we are playing with some of those things to allow kids to kind of be who
Flexible.
they are and yet still take the learning in. Can we allow, we were just talking about this in an elementary classroom, can we allow kids to eat and drink while they're learning? Why does snack time only have to happen at 10:15? Maybe I'm hungry at 20 minutes to 10. And when I'm hungry, I'm going to misbehave because I'm dysregulated. So just the way as teachers we often have a drink on our desk and we'll reach for it, would it be okay to allow kids to have a bottle of water on their desk and maybe a few crackers or something? So we are, I think, doing a nice job of beginning to talk to each other about in what ways can we as teachers accommodate through learning environment kids who are different learners and not necessarily the learner that we might have experienced 10 years ago.
We're using our OT and PTs in different ways now. So a teacher will call me and Lisa, I'd really like some flexible stuff. That's great. Have you talked to Jess and Diana? And we have them go into the classrooms, look at the kids, just to see what's happening. So we have purchased standing desks from kindergarten to high school. We have purchased bouncy yoga balls. We purchased things that I don't know if I could sit on. It's just literally a stool on a stick. It's a wobble, yeah. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if I could sit there, but we've also purchased like the little bike pedals to go under the desk.
Yeah.
Bands that go around your chair that you can like move your feet, and it's like a exercise band. So we have really started saying, okay, how do we get to the whole child? Because you can't get to that child until they're ready to learn. And how do we do that? And it's not by increasing the remedial services, it's really getting to what is the root of happening with them.
I mean, a very old-fashioned move that districts made a long, long time ago was recognizing that kids who come to school hungry are not ready to learn. So they put breakfast in schools. And for outside people who don't work with kids that way, it was like, well, why do we need to have breakfast in schools? Because when I'm hungry, I'm not listening to you. I'm so focused on the fact that I need something to eat. I cannot be ready to take in the learning. But if my stomach is full and I feel good about myself, then I'm ready. I'm open, I'm accessible, teach me. So, you know, there's some flexibility that we're putting in place, and I think actually people are excited about some of the changes that they're making in their classrooms in order to be able to accommodate some of the different issues that we're seeing in a way, again, of addressing the whole child.
Interesting.
Thank you.
I have one question just about the assessments. It seems like it's very focused on reading and math. Are there any other assessments for like arts
Yes.
and
History.
Yep, there are in their own. It was just easy for me to grab those, but
Okay,
yes,
those
they
are just
do
examples.
in their own coursework. They have the same sort of, I would say, self-imposed requirements, because as good teachers, they want to know, you know, did this child learn what we did? How much of, you know, how much of an understanding or perspective do they have? So they might give something short and quick for kids to do to get a feel for who already owns that skill and who I need to teach it to.
It might be a
So I would say
time,
yes.
time drawing, it may be,
Yeah,
there's
absolutely.
all kinds of little things that they do. It's not, as like Margaret said, easily accessible.
Right. Yeah.
Okay.
They're all very proud of their own areas, so they strive to make sure that they have the information they need, not just for them to feel good about it, but for the kids to be successful. So.
Does anybody else have questions, comments?
Thank you.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you.
That was
Thank you.
a really good comprehensive look at assessments. I don't think anybody's explained it to me in quite so stepwise a fashion, and bringing it all together really helps.